live streaming from the Central Church of Christ in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And we're delighted that you are with us in this live stream and in our continuing study of the book of Acts in the New Testament. If you would, if you have your Bible and have not already done so, open to Acts chapter 23, which is where we're going to resume our study this morning, Acts chapter 23. If you have the worksheets which were emailed out or sent out by link attachment, they begin at page 141, chapter 23 of the book of Acts, and we'll work through those questions together as we look at this chapter today. As we ended our study last week, we saw that Paul was brought before the Sanhedrin, which was a Jewish court-like body consisting of some 70 elders, religious leaders among the Jews. And on that body were Pharisees, were Sadducees. There was the high priest. It was a very, I would say, pompous, very showy organization. They took great pride in their religious standing. And this was a group of people, these various groups, Pharisees and Sadducees, with whom our Lord often had encounters, friction. They were jealous of his attention, and they saw him as a threat to their pompous position and their power. So this is not exactly a friendly body. Having said that, there were exceptions to that. There were those on the council who were much more honest, perhaps more sincere, were not so antagonistic to the Apostle Paul and to the cause of Christ. And within that body of 70 religious leaders, there was a lot of friction and internal friction among themselves. The Pharisees mistrusted the Sadducees and vice versa, and they each had their various dogmas. So it was not really a united body in many ways either. And the Apostle Paul, we need to remember, he was familiar with this situation. So as he stood before this body and was basically in a position of having to defend his actions and defend himself, he knew that he was speaking to a mixed group. And many of them he probably knew. He probably had worked with them in his prior labors. He was raised, remember, at the feet of Gamaliel, instructed according to the strict tenets of Jewish law, a Pharisee of Pharisees. So he knew a lot of these men. He was instrumental, of course, in persecuting the church and had received orders or letters from the high priest himself to that end back on the road to Damascus, which we studied previously back in Acts chapter 9. So here he is before this group of people. I'm going to begin reading in Acts 22, verse 30, just for context, and we'll read on down through verses 1 and 2 in Acts 23. But on the morrow, desiring to know the certainty wherefore he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to come together, and brought Paul down and set him before them. Chapter 23. And Paul, looking steadfastly on the council, said, Brethren, I have lived before God in all good conscience until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. Now let's stop here and notice on the worksheet here again, this is page 141, that the council that's referenced here refers to this high Jewish tribunal known as the Sanhedrin. And it was presided over by the high priest. At this time, that was Ananias. Question 2 says, in your own words, state Paul's opening remark. Basically, what he is saying is, I have always done what I believed was right. Right up until this day, Paul was living with a good conscience. He says, I've lived before God in all good conscience until this day. Well, what did he mean by that? Well, if you compare the verses that are cited there in the materials, look over in chapter 26 and verse 9, and also back at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, where Paul is writing to Timothy years later about his own background. He says that he had obtained mercy, though he was before a blasphemer and injurious, but he obtained mercy because he had done these things in all good faith, or done them ignorantly. He didn't believe at the time that what he was doing was wrong. He thought he was carrying out the will of God. So even when he was persecuting the church, he felt he was doing God's will. That speaks highly of Paul's conscience and of his moral integrity. Not only that he always tried to do what was right, but he was able and willing to change when his error was pointed out to him. In a proud display of disgust, Ananias orders those that were near Paul to smite him or strike or hit him on the mouth. This is a way of putting him in his place, of showing Ananias's power and his low opinion for Paul and what Paul was standing for. Verses 3 through 5. Then said Paul unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. And sittest thou to judge me according to the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? And they that stood by said, Revilest thou God's high priest? And Paul said, I knew not, brethren, that he was high priest, for it is written, Thou shalt not speak evil of a ruler of thy people. Question 1, Paul promptly responded to this blow to the mouth by saying, quote, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. That was a proverbial expression. You can compare that to Jesus' statement in Matthew 23:27, which is referenced there in your materials. Jesus referred to whited sepulchres, you remember? And again, he was speaking to the Pharisees, or speaking about the Pharisees, and he said, Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, and that they were like whited or painted sepulchres or tombs, beautiful on the outside, but inwardly they were full of dead men's bones, and it was a sight of ugliness and disgust. Notice that Paul, no doubt, was angry when he made this statement, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. This points out to us that being angry is not necessarily wrong. There are times when we should be angry. There are times when Christians need to be worked up, if you will. There are times in our Lord's life where he displayed great anger. For example, when he cleared the temple of the money changers. But there's a difference between anger and uncontrolled anger. The Bible says in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, be angry and sin not. So it's possible to be angry about something without being sinful, losing control, losing our temper, if you will. That is impermissible. But Paul is obviously very angry here, and he points out next the inconsistency of this high priest's actions. As standing there as his legal judge, that is, according to the law, and yet commanding that Paul be smitten. Can you imagine a prisoner standing in court saying something that the judge didn't like, and the judge orders the guard or the officer beside the prisoner to slap him on the face? That's basically what's happened here. Was the high priest's command to smite Paul lawful? Answer, no. So Paul correctly identified the inconsistency in his actions, and he calls him on it. However, to take that the step further, we find that those who stood by said, Revilest thou God's high priest? Which of the following best describes the next question to Paul? Well, it's that first choice there under question 3. Are you Are you showing disrespect for God's ordained leader, the high priest? We need to remember that a rebuke like Paul was issuing might be right and proper in and of itself, but may be out of place or wrong when it is addressed to a duly ordained ruler, such as this. And so Paul, when this is pointed out to him, now knowing this is the high priest, says, in essence, he responds, he indicates that he could not tell that the man was the high priest. He says, I did not know that he is the high priest. And then he recognizes his duty to respect rulers in his quotation from Exodus chapter 22 and verse 28, which says, "Thou shalt not speak evil of a ruler of thy people." I think there's a good lesson here for us folks in this country now or at any time. We need to be very, very careful about speaking evil of a ruler of the people. The scriptures are very clear on that, that we are to have respect for authority. We're to have respect for the ordained civil authorities. Paul said in Romans chapter 13 and verse 1, "Let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers." Be in subjection to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. So it is wrong for Christians or anyone to revile or to speak evil of our leaders. Now, that doesn't mean we can't disagree, we can't respectfully assert a disagreement or a contrary opinion. It doesn't mean we can't vote or work to change leadership, but whoever is in a position of civil leadership, we need to show respect, whether it be the President of the United States or a local police officer. We need to show respect for the position because that is ordained by God. So someone might say, well, how could Paul not have known that this was the high priest? But when you study the makeup of the Sanhedrin, remember there were 70 men there, and it is very likely that the high priest was known by facial recognition to the others, but he was not wearing any badge or insignia or special robes or clothing that would call him out as the high priest. So it's very likely that Paul is exactly truthful here when he says, I did not know that he is the high priest, meaning I wouldn't have addressed him in that way if I had known. All right, Acts 23, verses 6 through 10. But when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. Touching the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called into question." And when he had so said, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. And there arose a great clamor, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' part stood up and strove, saying, "We find no evil in this man. And what if a spirit hath spoken to him, or an angel?" And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should be torn in pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the castle. All right, there's several interesting points in these verses, so let's work through the questions together. Number one, this is on page 142. What important distinction among the crowd did Paul recognize? Well, he recognized the distinction between the Pharisees and Sadducees. He could see that there were Pharisees in the crowd, there were also Sadducees. And he used this to his advantage, knowing their differences from his own background. So, question two, recognizing the situation, Paul exclaims, "Brethren, I am a blank." The answer is a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. Now we note here that Paul uses these descriptions not literally, but to broadly identify the precise points of difference and agreement he had with portions of his audience, which they immediately understood. In other words, he's aligning himself with certain truthful doctrines held by the Pharisees. Not everything that the Pharisees believed was wrong. They believed in the resurrection. They believed in the spirit world, to include angels. The Sadducees denied these truths. So Paul had in common with the Pharisees something that he didn't have with the Sadducees, and he uses that and identifies himself with the Pharisees. I think that is the sense in which he's speaking here. Which of the following does Paul say is the cause of the questioning? Well, it would be the hope and resurrection of the dead. You see, the hope that we have in being raised from the dead, that was the cause of that is the Sadducees' anger and opposition to Paul, because they claimed that there is no resurrection of the dead. So when Paul's preaching the gospel, obviously the resurrection is a central part of the gospel, preaching the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. Well, the Sadducees would become enraged. That can't be. There is no resurrection. And so Paul correctly identifies that issue as the point of argument. That is, he says, the cause of the questioning. Now, question 4 asks us to place a P beside the description of a Pharisee and an S beside the description of a Sadducee from verse 8. Look at this list here in your material. Affirm the existence of angels and spirits. Who would that correctly describe? Well, that would be the Pharisees. Deny the reality of the resurrection. That would be the Sadducees, you see. Affirm the reality of the resurrection. That would be the Pharisees. And the last one on that list is deny the existence of angels and spirits. That would be the Sadducees. So you have two broad realms here, the resurrection and the spirit world, being affirmed by the Pharisees, but the same two realities being denied by the Sadducees. From verses 7 through 10, what was the effect of Paul's exclamation? Well, the text says a great dissension arose among the crowd and they were divided. That is, a great disagreement arose. You can just picture, like at a political gathering, some issue being introduced into the crowd about which they were split, how that would tend to divide the crowd. Now, there's a discussion question in on number 6 there, which says, were Paul's actions on this occasion proper and right? I wish that we were meeting in person so that we could have this discussion, but let me just throw out a few things for your consideration here. I would say that his actions on this occasion were proper, they were right. He was not intentionally bringing about an uproar or causing a riot or even dissension between these parties. There's no evidence that he knew this would result in any kind of violence. We need to remember that Paul knew that the Sadducees were the prime objectors to his work. The Sadducees were the prime objectors. They were objecting to his work here, and that their hatred of him stemmed from this resurrection issue. He knew that. So when in introducing that issue, he is aligning himself with part of the Pharisees' teaching. It worked perfectly. He basically sets them on themselves in order to blunt their hatred or efforts toward him. Question 7, for fear that Paul would be blank, that is, torn in pieces in the confusion, the chief captain ordered the soldiers to bring Paul into the castle. Verse 10. Remember now, the chief captain is the Roman in charge civilly, and he sees a tumult or a great, almost a riot about to occur, and so he grabs Paul, has him brought by the soldiers into the castle. All right, Acts 23, chapter 23, verses 11 through 25. We're going to read verse 11. And the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, Be of good cheer, for as thou hast testified concerning me at Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. True or false? Paul's state of mind up until the time of this verse was well settled and perfectly at ease. I think that is obviously false. That is false because he was not well settled. How do you know that? Because the Lord himself appears to him, stands by him, the text says, and cheers him up, says, be of good cheer, and then gives him a glimpse into the future to lift his spirits. You know, such an appearance would not have occurred were it not needed. Clearly it was needed, it was necessary because of Paul's status here and his state of mind. Number 2, in an encouraging and remarkable incident, Paul saw the blank, that is the Lord, Jesus, standing beside him and saying, be of good cheer, that is, be happy, be cheerful. And Jesus further promised that Paul would what? Would bear witness of him, that is, of Jesus, at Rome, as he had in Jerusalem. This tells Paul, not only are you going to survive this here in Jerusalem, you're going to be going to Rome. And you're going to be bearing witness of me, Jesus says, even in Rome. Verse 12, and when it was day, the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And there were more than 40 that made this conspiracy. And they came to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a great curse to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. And now therefore do ye with the council signify to the chief captain that he bring him down unto you as though you would judge of his case more exactly, and we, before he comes near, are ready to slay him. We're ready to kill him. So, question 1, when day came, a band of blank. The answer is Jews, a band of Jews. And the text says they bound themselves under a curse, which means that they promised to carry out their plot, that they would not eat or drink until they had killed Paul. How many participate in this? The text says more than 40. You've got a large group of men making an oath to themselves, binding it under a curse to kill Paul. True or false, this plot was kept secret from the Sanhedrin. Well, that's false. They actually tell the Sanhedrin what they've done, what they want to happen. And the council is to assemble and hear more exactly concerning Paul. But when Paul is being brought to them, they would put him to death. They would ambush him on the way. The plot amounted to an ambush of Paul as he would be brought to the council with the permission of the unsuspecting Lysias. And by the way, that name should be spelled Lysias. And there are several places on this page where it's misspelled, so you can correct that, and it'll be corrected in the final edition here, but it's Lysias. Claudius Lysias, he was a Roman. He was the chief captain, the military leader He is the one who was unsuspecting what the Jews were going to try to do, and they were going to kill Paul out to Lysias. Had their plan been carried out, what do you think was the likelihood of its success? Well, I tell you, having traveled in Jerusalem and seen those narrow streets, and think about a band of 40 men ready to pounce upon a party of 2 or 3 men transporting Paul, they would have succeeded overwhelmingly. They would have killed Paul. The chances of the success of this plot were extremely high. But anytime you get 40 men involved in some kind of conspiracy, it's pretty hard to keep it a secret, and word gets out, and their plan is foiled, and that's what is described in the next few verses here. Verse 16. But Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, and he came and entered into the castle and told Paul. And Paul called unto him one of the centurions and said, Bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he hath something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the chief captain, and saith, Paul the prisoner called me unto him, and asked me to bring this young man unto thee, who hath something to say to thee. And the chief captain took him by the hand, and going aside, asked him privately, What is it that thou hast to tell me? And he said, The Jews have agreed to ask thee to bring down Paul tomorrow unto the council, as though thou wouldst inquire somewhat more exactly concerning him. Do not thou therefore yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, who have bound themselves under a curse, neither to eat nor to drink, till they have slain him. And now are they ready, looking for the promise from thee. So the chief captain let the young man go, charging him, Tell no man that thou hast signified these things to me. All right. Question 1, who heard of the plot and informed Paul? Well, that would be Paul's sister's son. That is his nephew. We notice that this is the only mention in the book of Acts of Paul's family. And the reason for the nephew's presence in Jerusalem is unexplained. So we're just given just a passing quick glance here into the family of Paul. We might wish that we knew more, but that's all we're told. Hearing the news, Paul directed one of the centurions, to bring the young man to the chief captain. Now, does that suggest to you, even in prison, that maybe Paul had gained some respect and some authority? Yes. How do you know that? Well, otherwise, such a request would have probably been just ignored. But Paul had the clout, even in prison, to get word of this to Claudius Lysias. True or false, the centurion refused to comply with Paul's directions. That's false. He not only complied, he made sure that it happened, and the word from this young man was transmitted to Lysias. Lysias probably took the young man aside privately and then told him to keep the matter secret because he was concerned for the safety of the nephew. I mean, think about it. You got 40 Jews who have bound themselves to kill Paul. If word got out that it was this young man who spoiled their plot, then he would be in danger. So Lysias acts very wisely here in keeping this anonymous and protects the identity of the young man, the nephew. Acts 23, verse 23. And he called unto him 2 of the centurions and said, Make ready 200 soldiers to go as far as Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200, at the 3rd hour of the night. And he bade them provide beasts, that they might set Paul thereon, and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter after this form. Question 1. Lysias responded to the news of the conspiracy by arranging to escort Paul to whom? To Felix. Felix, who was the governor and he would have been located in the city of Caesarea. By the way, Caesarea is right there on the coast. Caesarea Philippi was the seat of Roman government there in that district. Identify the arrangements made for this escort. Well, there were 200 soldiers. We know that because a centurion was over 100 soldiers, and there were 2 centurions involved. So you got a lot of soldiers, 200 of them. There were 70 horsemen. There were 200 spearmen. That's a correction on the material there. It should say 200, not 20. 200 spearmen. They were to leave at 9 o'clock p.m. We know that because it's identified as the 3rd hour of the night. Remember that their night began at 6 o'clock. So 6 p.m., counting 3 hours forward, would put us at 9 o'clock p.m. They were to carry Paul on animals, and they were to also bring a letter to Felix. Well, here we have the letter set out beginning at verse 26. Claudius Lysias unto the most excellent governor, Felix, greeting. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be slain of them when I came upon them and the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And desiring to know the cause wherefore they accused him, I brought him down unto their council, whom I found to be accused about questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. And when it was shown to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to thee forthwith, charging his accusers also to speak against him before thee. Now, there are several things in that letter that are very interesting. It is largely a faithful, that is, a truthful letter, with one glaring inaccuracy, I guess we would say. Well, let's notice that. The letters of that day usually began with the name of the sender. Rather than putting at the end, when we write a letter today, we usually sign it at the end. Why would they do that? Well, because they were using scrolls, and when you start to unwind the scroll and start to read it, obviously the first thing you want to know is, who's this from? So they would put their name right up at the top, and that's why you see in the New Testament letters, the epistles like Romans and Corinthians, the very first line, you'll see the name of the writer. This was a letter from Claudius Lysias to the most excellent governor, Felix. All right. Is the letter a faithful account of what happened? Well, almost. There's one problem in this letter that's not really correct, but otherwise it's very close. He, Lysias, didn't actually rescue Paul because he was a Roman. He learned that he was a Roman in the course of binding him and just about to scourge him. You remember? He had bound him and he was about to scourge him when he finds out that he's a Roman. Now, Lysias doesn't tell those things. He leaves those facts out. So he makes the letter very self-complimentary. But other than that, it is basically factually accurate. All right, verse 31. I'm sorry. The rest of that question there, the discussion question says, what, if any, new light does it shed on our knowledge of Lysias and his handling of the matter? Well, it does say that Lysias had determined that Paul was not worthy of death, that he had done nothing that was a capital offense. He says nothing worthy of death, which tells us, incidentally, that he would have been released. Lysias would have had to release Paul. But because of this plot, the plot actually backfires on these 40 men. It actually saves Paul because it forces Lysias to send him on to the governor, Felix, in Caesarea. Verse 31. So the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But on the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and returned to the castle. And they, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, presented Paul also before him. And when he had read it, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia, I will hear thee fully, said he, when thine accusers also are come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's palace. So, question 1 there, the soldiers brought Paul to Antipatris as they had been commanded. Now, we notice that that city, Antipatris, was roughly halfway to Caesarea. It was about 30 miles from Jerusalem to Antipatris, and there would have been another 30 miles on to Caesarea. So evidently they felt like if we can get him safely halfway, then the danger is past. The danger of Paul's Jerusalem enemies was not so much of a concern from that point on, so as to require these soldiers to go the rest of the way. So the 70 horsemen continued with Paul, but the others came on back to their base in Jerusalem. Okay, so they went with Paul to Caesarea, where they delivered the letter, and they presented Paul to the governor. Question 3, what question did Felix ask Paul? Well, he says, what province are you from? Of what province are you? Why would he have asked that question? Can you suggest a reason? Well, it might have been just simple curiosity, or he may have been looking for a way out of dealing with this matter. If it had been, some convenient province, I'll send you over there and let Governor so-and-so take care of this, sort of a jurisdictional question. But when he learned that it was Cilicia, that would have meant a sea voyage. If you notice on the map there, you can see Cilicia, the purple area across up northward over the Mediterranean Sea, all the way up to Tarsus is where Paul was actually born. So that's a sea voyage that would have been required. And Felix says, I'll hear the case. I'll hear it fully. True or false? Felix agreed to hear Paul's case when his accusers from Jerusalem arrived. That's true. These Jews from Jerusalem, including Ananias, the high priest, would have to arrive, and he would give them a few days to arrive. So he commands Paul to be kept where? In Herod's palace. In Herod's palace, also known as the Praetorium, which is a term we've heard before. Chapter 24. Verse 1, and after 5 days the high priest Ananias came down with certain elders and with an orator, one Tertullius, and they informed the governor against Paul. All right. If you recall back in 23, verses 21 through 35, and think about the 5 days, how long was Paul detained in Herod's palace until his accusers arrived in Caesarea? Well, he was there for the 5 days. And so what we've got is a relatively short period of time of detention, pre-trial, if you will. Number 2, identify those involved with accusing Paul. Well, there was the high priest, Ananias. We've already learned something about his ugly character. He was the one who commanded Paul to be slapped on the face, you remember. Secondly, there was an orator named Tertullus. This would be like an attorney, a lawyer, who would be the prosecuting attorney. He would state the case against Paul. And thirdly, there were certain elders. These were likely prominent Pharisees who were in that Sanhedrin that came with the high priest. What is meant by the phrase, quote, they informed the governor against Paul? Well, they stated their case. They put on their case against Paul. Verses 2 through 4. And when he was called, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy much peace, and that by thy providence evils are corrected for this nation, we accept it in all ways and in all places, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness. But that I be not further tedious unto thee, I entreat thee to hear us of thy clemency a few words. All right. So here you have the words of their attorney, their orator. An orator was very polished in public speaking and the art of oratory. True or false? He begins his case by complimenting the governor Felix. Yes, that's true. Pays him very complimentary introductory statements, which were probably true. For what did Tertullus express thanks? Well, the peace that they enjoyed under his rule. Also, his correcting of evils or crimes. So he's complimenting those things. And then Tertullus moves toward his point so that he's not further tedious. That word means trying or annoying to Felix, but he entreats him. That is, he earnestly pleads with him to hear a blank, a few words. You know, a lot of public speakers will start by saying, I won't be long. I've got just a few words. And that's what this one does. And he says, so I beg you to listen, be patient, listen out of your clemency, he says, or leniency or mercy for a few words. All right, we are nearly out of time, so I'm going to be stopping there at Acts chapter 24, verse 5. And this is a good spot to stop because in the next 2 or 3 verses, you're going to see the actual charges and how watered down they have become as opposed to what you would have expected back in Jerusalem. And then we're going to see the results. I do want you to notice there on the map, we'll get to that, Lord willing, Paul's journey to Rome. That map depicts that journey, and you may want to be reading ahead several chapters. We're getting near toward the end of this book. The pace will pick up as we go through these sea voyages all the way back to Rome because of Paul's appeal. The worksheets will be issued again this week, Lord willing. If you have any trouble receiving those, please let us know. And one last announcement. If you are not receiving the texts or emails weekly from the church here, I'm talking now to members of the congregation, please let Jonathan know so that he can add you to that list. The Acts sheets are sent out that way. If you're not a member here and you'd like to receive the Acts sheets, just let us know. A number of you have emailed us. We've sent you those Acts sheets, and we'd be happy to do that so you can continue to join us for the class. I think we're almost out of time. Is that right? All right. Thank you very much for your attention and for joining us in this. And I do invite you to attend the next hour. Stay tuned. We'll begin in about 15 minutes with our worship hour. Thanks for joining us for this Bible study this morning.